Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about the rise of dictators that takes place after World War I. Before we get too into it, I wanted to start with a little quick warm-up. So here we see a picture on the left, and we see a little caption that says, "These children are playing with marks," which is the German currency used during the Weimar Republic, which is, the government that we set up in Germany after World War I. And there's a few questions here. I'll let you look over it for just a second. First question says, what does this picture tell you about the value of the mark? Well, if my money was super, super valuable, I'm not going to let a bunch of kids and a dog play with it out on the streets. So we can, kind of extrapolate that this money is pretty much worthless, right? It's literally cheaper than children toys. How did this happen? Well, this happened because World War I, right? Germany loses World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles is going to place harsh conditions on Germany that's going to really deplete the value of their economy. And as we see here, literally the value of the dollar or the mark. Explain how you think people in Germany felt about this. Well, I'd be very frustrated. If my money was this worthless, that children are playing with stacks of them, I'm going to be very frustrated, and I'm going to be looking for a change. And that's exactly what ends up happening. Before we get into the specific dictators, I did want to talk to you about different forms of government that are emerging, not just around this time, but becoming more popular around this time. So first we have socialism. Socialism is an economic policy where the government owns a lot. And they're the ones who kind of, control everything and divvy things out. Now, an even more advanced or more extreme form of socialism is communism. Now, if you're in my class, you've heard about communism. This is what ends up becoming of Russia, right? They transform into the USSR. And they fall to communism. So the first communist state. This is an economic and also political policy where the government owns absolutely everything. And the idea is if the government owns everything and can divvy things out, everybody has the exact same amount and no one's really living in poverty. That's the idea. And as I mentioned, right, it's a more extreme form of socialism. Fascism is going to be another idea that kind of begins to become really popular around this time period. Fascism is a little harder to define, but for the most part, there's always a central authority. It's almost always one person, a dictator, and they use terror and harsh military control to maintain power. We'll talk more about that in just a second. And then lastly, form of government, totalitarian. So all the people we're going to talk about, all the forms of government we're going to talk about today are totalitarian governments. These are governments that have absolute control over every aspect of their citizens' lives. They're very, very limited rights. The idea of free speech and stuff completely out the window. So this is a new kind of mindset to wrap our heads around as we move forward. Fascism, just to go into a little more detail, some common characteristics that you're going to see in a majority of governments that are classified as being fascist. The nation's going to be celebrated. Think nationalism on steroids. So complete and utter devotion to the country, to the mother country. It's always controlled by one political power. This is almost always a dictator. The citizens' rights are strictly limited. The economy is going to be absolutely controlled by the government. A call to action against enemies, military, and male strength is glorified. War under a fascist regime is like the epitome of prestige, right? Going to war is seen as, the highest level you can unlock as a citizen. And what's really interesting is when you see it on a spectrum here, a lot of times people, hear fascism and communism, think those are kind of similar. They're actually complete opposites. If we put things on a spectrum here, right, and this is the very, very center, of course, and when you hear of, in the United States at least, when you hear of right-wing stuff, that's usually Republicans. When you hear left-wing, that's usually Democrats. But if we move even further down here, what we have completely to the right, most people acknowledge as fascism. And then as we move down the spectrum towards the left, we have socialism. And then, of course, farther down the spectrum, that purer form of socialism, we get communism. All right, so that was a really long way of kind of explaining these, but I obviously, generalized greatly. There are 2 great videos, this one and then that one as well. If you have access to the PowerPoint, please go ahead and watch those if you feel like you need a little bit deeper understanding of the differences between these, because they are kind of hard to keep straight, because they do have a lot of similarities in terms of characteristics, but they are, for the most part, complete opposites. All right, now that we understand the types of governments, let's talk about the types of governments that form the rise of dictators after World War I. Our objective question: how and why did dictators come to power in the post-World War I era? Well, let's get into it. The first man we're going to start with, if this will come up, takes control of Spain. His name is Francisco Franco. All right, and he's a fascist that comes to power and takes control of the country of Spain, and he does this through the help of Germany and Italy. All right, so Francisco Franco reaches out. He says, hey, Germany, hey, Italy, I like what you guys are doing. I kind of want to do that here in my own country. Can you help me come to power? And he does. Even though Francisco Franco comes to power, even though he's a fellow dictator, even though he's a fellow fascist, when World War II breaks out, he's actually going to remain neutral. Spain is not going to engage in World War II, even though it seems that at least politically they're kind of aligned with, Germany especially. But for now, Francisco Franco comes to power in Spain. The reason this is important, kicking off our World War II unit and stuff, the reason we mention this is because Hitler, the leader of Germany, is going to use the Civil War and the revolution of Francisco Franco coming to power as an opportunity to have a kind of practice run, a dry run, kind of like a scrimmage. He's going to use the Spanish Revolution as a test run to try out his war practices, to try out his troops, to make sure the weapons are, doing everything they should, and it goes well, and Hitler is encouraged by this. Here's a great quote from Franco. We do not believe in government through the voting booth. Spain has no foolish dreams. All right, so he's a little intense. Definitely doesn't sound like he would be a friend of the United States. All right, next we're moving on to Italy. Italy is controlled at this point by a man named Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini was a fascist. He wanted to bring the glory of the Roman Empire back to Italy. Him and his, little cohort convinced the Italian king to step aside, and he becomes the leader, the dictator of Italy. After coming to power, he's going to start his invasion, and he's going to begin to invade a lot of northern Africa are easy targets for them. So Benito Mussolini, leader of Italy, fascist. Here's a great quote from him. Let us have a dagger between our teeth, a bomb in our hands, and an infinite scorn in our hearts. So he's fun at parties. Fun fact, Mussolini was actually expelled from school twice and then later became a teacher before he came to power. Believe it or not, the sky's limitless for us teachers, I suppose. Next, Germany is controlled by a man that I'm sure we've all heard of before, Adolf Hitler, otherwise known as the Führer. Okay? Hitler is going to come to power. He's going to become the leader of the Nazi Party. I have in very, very small, little tiny letters, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. We know that as the Nazis. We'll continue to use the term Nazis. We're familiar with Hitler and his policy, right? He targets the Jews. He uses them as scapegoats. He blames the rough patch that Germany is going through after World War I on the Jews. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the Holocaust and how he actually convinced people to believe that, but that was his plan and it worked well. He also published a book called Mein Kampf, which in German means my struggle. He writes this while he's imprisoned, and he basically, talks about all the roughness that Germany's going through and how he's going to fix everything. After coming to power, Hitler quickly starts to rampage, and he's going to take over a series of different places. We'll talk about those in more detail when we talk about appeasement. But for now, Hitler, leader of Germany. Here's a great quote. Make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it. And that perfectly summarizes exactly what Hitler does in terms of scapegoating and stuff like that. Here's some more pictures. We're all familiar with, Germany and the Nazis at this point. Fun fact, Hitler was actually Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. So interesting how that goes. This is a great video if you have access to the PowerPoint. Go ahead and watch this. It's only about 2.5 minutes long. A great summary of how he was able to come to power. And last but not least, last person we're going to talk about today, leader of the Soviet Union during the Post-World War I era. After Lenin dies, Joseph Stalin comes to power. He changes his name to Stalin, which in Russian means Stalin means steel. So Joseph Stalin begins to identify himself as the man of steel. He is the only communist we're talking about today, communism where the government controls absolutely everything. He comes to power by killing off his competition after Lenin dies, and he starts to rapidly industrialize. He puts the Soviet Union on a 5-year plan. He begins to shut down, private farms. The government absorbs those people who have lost their farms, move to the city, start working in factories, and starts to really rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. He does do a good job doing that. He shuts down all competition. All people who are against him, get taken and never seen again. If you're critical of the government, you get a knock on your door at night and you're never seen again. He had large concentration camps that he would send people to. Millions of people are going to die underneath Stalin's regime, and that's before World War II. And then later he'll sign a non-aggression pact with Germany, but more on that later. Here's a great quote. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? Really powerful stuff. Really kind of shows you what these people prioritize. Here's another fun fact. Stalin's son was actually a soldier in World War II. He was captured by the Nazis. He was thrown in a prison. Hitler tried to negotiate trades between Stalin's son and other people that Hitler wanted back, and Stalin said no. He absolutely refused to do any kind of bartering or trading with for his son, and his son would later die in prison. Accounts of his death are kind of iffy, the son I'm talking about. Some people say he committed suicide by running into electrified fence. Other people said he was shot, but either way he dies in prison. And when Stalin gets the heartbreaking news that his son has died in prison, his only response is, "Fate treated him unjustly." So really shows you what this guy kind of thinks and feels about. Oh, sorry, we do have one more person. I knew we were missing someone. Last country we're going to talk about is, of course, Japan. And Japan technically kind of has two leaders. And this is something that people get confused, so make sure you get this right. Japan has technically two leaders. They have an emperor, and the emperor is a man named Hirohito. Now, the emperor is technically the person who's in control of Japan. He's the person that all of the Japanese people look to. He's the person that the Japanese people believe is part God, right? So there's Hirohito, who's totally, the leader. But then there's the guy who's actually in charge, and that's Hideki Tojo. Tojo's going to be the prime minister of Japan. Tojo's the one who's pulling all the strings. So if you were asked who the figurehead of Japan is, it's Hirohito. He sits there, he looks pretty, and he does whatever Tojo says. If you're asked who is actually the leader of Japan at this point, we should know it's Tojo. He's the one who's pulling all the strings. He's the one who is making all the decisions. He's the one who says, "Hirohito, I think we should do this," and he says, "Sure, fine, do it." So he's going to lead a very militaristic regime, and they're going to start invading Asian nations for materials. And that's going to be one of the things that brings the U.S. into the war, of course. Emperor Hirohito will believe what we tell him to believe. Perfectly exemplifies the relationship between these two men. Tojo's totally the one in control. Hirohito actually is so involved that we actually let him stay in power after Japan loses the war. Spoiler alert. So here's a great graphic I took from your textbooks. Feel free to look at that in a little bit more detail. And lastly, so how did this happen? How did these dictators with these scary regimes, right? Absolutely no, personal liberties or anything. How did they come to power? And the answer is, kind of twofold. It's the Treaty of Versailles mixed with economic depression. The Treaty of Versailles treated, specifically Germany, but other nations too were very disadvantaged of the Treaty of Versailles. Then the economic depression kicks in. Everybody's poor, everybody's broke. The marks specifically are worth absolutely nothing. And to put it as simply as possible, these people came to power because people were desperate. They wanted a change. They wanted something new. And when these people offered them something new, they jumped on it. All right, that's it. Have a good one.